Welcome to this lesson. We are still in Unit 1 looking at poetry appreciation. This is the part 2 of our poetry appreciation lesson. Again, poems are to be enjoyed. In our last lesson, we saw that poems are artistic expressions. They demand that you appreciate them before you begin to reduce them to something explainable. We also saw that often the most brilliant elements in a poem are very subtle and will be felt before they are understood. We also saw that analyzing poetry offers you a special opportunity to interact with a work of art. And we also saw that this interaction is what we often refer to as poetry appreciation. Again, in our last lesson, we saw that appreciation simply means to evaluate and analyze a poem in order to have a better understanding. I hope you remember these that we saw in our last lesson. We also asked ourselves why students do not enjoy poems. And we saw that the fear of poetry makes it difficult for students to enjoy poetry. We got to understand that it is important to overcome this fear through practice and a clear understanding that poems are to be enjoyed. I hope by now you are beginning to enjoy poetry. Indeed, you need to enjoy poetry and not fear poetry. Again, we saw that appreciation enables us to get a better understanding of the poem and to notice its beauty. We saw that to appreciate a poem, it was important to break the poem down into, in this case, 5 aspects. There are different ways of doing it, and one of the easiest ways of getting to understand the poem is to try and break it down into these 5 elements. And in our last lesson, we looked at one of them, which is the major one, and that had to do with the issues that are raised in the poem. The others include the physical structure, the patterns, the language, and then the type of poem. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the physical structure and the patterns in the poetry. The physical structure. Let's look at the physical structure first. After reading the poem 2 or 3 times, it is important to determine the physical structure of the poem by briefly considering the type of poem, the number of stanzas, number of lines, length of lines, etc. These are things that you can see physically when you look at the poem as it is on paper. Without getting into any serious details, you will just see these things in the poem. That's why we call them the physical structure. The following questions should help you bring out the physical structure of a poem. Question 1. What type of poem is it? Looking at the physical appearance. If you look at the poem as it is written on the paper, what type of poem is it? Now, without getting into details, for example, if I see a poem has 14 lines, it appears to suggest it could be a sonnet. Okay, so now I will then look at the other physical aspects of a sonnet and see if a poem looks like what it presents. If a poem is talking about an apple and it is structured in the form of an apple, we will say this is an emblematic poem. So looking at the poem physically, in terms of the number of lines, in terms of the how it is structured, what type of poem could it be? We will later look at the type of poem at the 5th item, which will deal with type of poem based on other issues. But in this one, you are just looking at physically how the poem looks. Does it look like somebody who was in a quiet mood meditating? Does it look like somebody? How does the poem look on paper? Is it a story? So that you could, for example, say it's a narrative. Does it look like somebody pouring his feeling? We'll look more into these in our later lessons. But the first question you need to answer in attempting to understand the physical structure of a poem is to try to understand the type of poem, looking at it physically. Second question is, how many stanzas does the poem have? So you need to tell us, okay, this is a sonnet. You have that is in question 1. Depend based on how the poem looks. Now, how many stanzas are there? Does it have one? Is it a one block poem? Does it have 2 stanzas, 3 stanzas? How many stanzas are there in the poem? These are things you can see when you look at the poem physically. Question 3. What is the number of lines in each stanza? So you count in each stanza, maybe in stanza 1 you have 3 lines, stanza 4 you have 4 lines, stanza 5 you have 10 lines. Say it. What is the total number of lines? In all, how many lines do we have in the poem? These are things you can see physically when you look at the poem. And the fourth question is, what is the length of the lines? Are they generally long or short? Does the poem have long lines? Does the poem have short lines? Does it have medium? Are some long and some short? These are things you can see when you look at the poem physically. So feel free to talk about all these things. The fifth question is, what is the dominant point of view? Is the poem presented from the first person point of view, from the second person point of view, from the third person point of view, or is it an apostrophe? How is the poem presented? Now, sometimes you will notice that it may be presented predominantly in the first person, but you may find a third person along the line. Feel free to make all these observations. So you note the predominant point of view. If there are switches in the point of view, bring it out. Remember, you are trying to understand the poem. So anything you observe gives you more insight into the poem. Now the sixth question. Are the writer's words simple or complex? Does the writer use in this poem simple words, complex words? Are the words modern? Are they archaic? All these, as you observe, actually give you more insight into the poem. So when you see that the poet uses simple words, say it, put it down, because it helps you to understand the poem better. If the words are complex, say it. If the words are modern or archaic, if there's a mixture, say it. These are things you note to help you understand the poem better. Now, so these 6 questions should actually help you to understand the poem better. They should help you to react to the poem better in terms of the physical structure. Well, let us now try to answer these 6 questions in a poem. Afterwards, I hope you're also going to try it in a poem on your own to be sure that you have understood these very well. Well, we continue with our poem that we used in the first lesson. That is, Death, be not proud. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful. For thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death. Nor yet canst thou kill me from rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be. But pleasure, then, from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go. Rest with their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Wise wellst thou then. One short sleep past, we wake eternal eye, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Beautiful poem by all standard. Let me read it just one more time. As we try to enjoy it, and as you listen to this lesson, try and read, for example, this poem on your own in a way that you will enjoy it. Just enjoy the poem. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not for death, nor yet canst thou kill me from rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be. Much pleasure then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swell thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Beautiful poem. Now the first question. We notice that first we need to know the type of poem, and from the physical appearance we can see the poem has the features of an Italian sonnet. If you remember your lessons on sonnet, you remember that there are basically two main types of sonnet: the Shakespearean sonnet or English sonnet, and then the Italian sonnet or Petrarchan sonnet. And you remember the Petrarchan sonnet, all sonnets, of course, have 14 lines. The Petrarchan sonnet, if you remember, is divided into an octave, which tells or raises the problem, and a sestet, which proffers a solution. And this is what happens in this poem. You'll also notice that the Italian sonnet has a particular rhyme scheme, and that is what happens in this poem. So physically looking at the poem, it is obviously an Italian sonnet, or you can just say it is a sonnet. Now the second question is the number of stanzas. Now this poem sometimes is presented as two stanzas. Sometimes it's presented as one stanza, but whichever way, whether it's presented in two stanzas or in one block, it actually has internal division of two stanzas or two parts. It is presented here as one block poem, but it is internally divided into an octave and a sestet. Sometimes this poem is actually presented as a two-stanza poem. Now the third question is the number of lines in each stanza, and the poem has 14 lines divided internally into an octave, that is 8 lines, and a sestet, which is 6 lines. So we have answered the first 3 questions. Let's move on to the rest of the questions, and we look at the fourth question, and that has to do with the length of lines. And we note that the lines are fairly long, consisting mostly of about 10 syllables on each line. You will notice that if you count most of the lines, indeed all the lines were supposed to have 10 syllables. There are 1 or 2 variations here and there, but almost all the lines actually have 10 syllables. So you can put it that way. You can also say the lines are quite long, and counting the number of words on each line you can use. So you can actually use the number of lines or the number of syllables. Any of them goes. Then the fifth question, that is the point of view. And the poem is written as an apostrophe. This can be seen from the use of words like thee, thou. Along the line, there is a shift to the third person as the speaker talks about people taken by death. Finally, the first person point of view comes in as the speaker attaches himself to the people taken and makes himself part of the final victory. Of course, this is not strange because death affects everybody. So it's not strange that we saw the first person, saw the second person, which is the apostrophe, and eventually saw also the third person. This actually highlights the fact that death has to do with virtually everybody, and It's interesting how the speaker actually joins himself to the final victory over death, as he says, one in the 13th line, one short sleep past, we. Now he doesn't say they. He actually was writing this poem. Of course, he was not dead, but he anticipates that he will die. But he attaches himself to the victory that comes later, as he says, we wake eternally. Now let's look at the next question that has to do with the rhyme scheme. The writer's words. The writer's words are mostly simple. However, there are considerable archaic words. These include words like thee, thou, thinkest, swearest. These are all archaic words. These are words we don't really use these days unless we want to look a bit archaic. I like archaic words anyway. So this brings us to the end of the second part, the second item, which has to do with the physical structure. So in looking at the physical structure, it's important to look at the type of poem, the number of stanzas, the number of lines on each stanza, the length of lines, the point of view, and look briefly at the writer's words, whether they are simple or complex, archaic or modern. Feel free to make all these observations. Now we move on to the next part. And that has to do with the patterns. Let us now look at the next item that has to do with the patterns that are observed in the poem. So far, we have seen the issues in the poem. We have seen the issues in the poem, the physical structure of the poem, and we will now look at the third part, which is the patterns in the poem. Of course, after reading the poem 2 or 3 times, it is important to determine the patterns of the poem by considering the rhetorical patterns, rhyme patterns, sound patterns, rhythm, and meter. Again, the following questions should help you bring out the patterns. 1. Are there rhetorical devices or devices of persuasion such as the rhetorical question, repetition, anaphora, epistrophe? These are devices that are used in persuasion, that are used for emphasis. Sometimes you want to emphasize something just to help enable you persuade somebody. We use these devices a lot. So look out for these devices in the poem. Do we have them in the poem at all, or they are not there? So if some are there, you may not be able to identify all of them, but as many as you can, do identify them. They all help you to understand the poem. Question 2. Are there rhymes? Are there end rhymes? Is there a regular rhyme scheme? Does the rhyme scheme have any significance? So you look out for rhymes, internal rhymes as well as the end rhymes, especially the end rhymes. Are they there? If they are there, you should be able to identify if there's a regular scheme. Question 3. Are there any significant sound patterns such as alliteration, assonance, consonance, onomatopoeia? These are devices of sound. Look at, do we have any of these patterns? Are they happening in the poem? If they are happening in the poem, feel free to say it. Question 4. What is the rhythm of the poem? Does the poem have a regular metrical pattern? And when we talk about metrical pattern, then we're talking about whether it has iambs, whether it has trochees. Look out for them. If any of them is there, feel free to say it. And in some poems, they may not be there at all. It may not have a regular metrical pattern. Feel free to say it. Let us now try to answer these 4 questions in a poem. As usual, our poem, Death, be not proud. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, O death, nor yet can thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be. Much pleasure then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go. Rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance schemes, and desperate men. And thus with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And copy all charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Whilst where thou then, one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Now, the first question has to do with the rhetorical patterns. The speaker allows some lines to run on whilst creating pauses. That is caesura. In the middle of lines, there is a rhetorical question in line 12. Thee and thou are repeated severally in the poem. So these are some of the rhetorical patterns in the poem. You find caesuras there, you find rhetorical question, this one there, and you find repetition, especially of thee, thou, it keeps emphasizing because it is an address. It is addressed actually to death. The second question has to do with the rhymes. The poem has end rhymes. The octave has a rhyme scheme A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And the sextet has a rhyme scheme C, D, D, C, E, E. The rhyme scheme of the octave seems to point to the fact that death has an up and down and reverse movement. You see A, B, B, then it reverses A, B, B, A, B, B, A, then it reverses A, B, B, A. So it is like A, B, then it reverses itself, B, A, then A, B, B, A. So it just comes and then it reverses itself. Sometimes some of these sometimes we call them chiasmus. Later maybe we'll talk about this, but that's what we observe in the poem. Whereas the varied rhyme scheme in the sextet appear to point to the varied nature of death. You know, in a Petrarchan sonnet, you know, the octave raises the problem. So the problem is the fact that death appears to raise itself. Death appears to be seen as so powerful. And then in the sextet, a solution is provided. And that has to do with the fact that he decides to convince himself that death is not what people say it is. It is just a slave, and it will be overcome. So you will notice that in that side, it becomes varied. Because death, of course, happens to everybody. So the poet appears to communicate some subliminal message even through the rhyme scheme. Now the third question. The third question has to do with the patterns of sound, whether there are some alliteration, assonance, and others. There are few patterns of alliteration, assonance and consonance in the poem. Of course, when we go through the poem, we will find a few of these devices. And as I have said it, make an attempt on your own to point out as many alliteration, assonance, and consonance in the poem as possible. On your own, try and look out for as many as you can find of these devices of sound. I have pointed out that there's alliteration, there's assonance, a few of them, there's consonance. Try and make out a few of them on your own and bring it up for discussion. The fourth question. The poem is written largely in iambic pentameters. Lines 1 and 9 appear to deviate slightly from this general pattern. So the pattern in the poem, in terms of the metrical pattern, is that it generally is written in iambic pentameters. I hope you remember what iambs are. In an iamb, we have one unstressed followed by one stressed syllable. I hope you remember. Good. So in this case, what we are saying is that most of the lines, in fact, the lines are supposed to be written, though that is one of the characteristics of a Petrarchan sonnet. The lines are usually written in iambic pentameters. Now, in this case, the very first line appears to have a problem. In an iamb, you suppose, if it is iambic pentameters, it's supposed to begin with an unstressed sound, but this one appears to begin with a stress. Death, of course, death is stressed. Death. So that appears to be, and you notice that the first line doesn't have the 10 syllables. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee. It appears one syllable is missing. Some have suggested that that strong pause in the middle, that is, death, be not proud, where you break, the poet thinks is strong enough or good enough to add as a syllable, but that's a little problem with that line. So that line actually seems to have only 9 syllables instead of 10, and it's not properly an iambic pentameter, that first line. And we also note that the line 9, that is, thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Now, if you look at it carefully, you will notice that it has thou art, count with me, thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. It appears to have 11 syllables. For this one, it begins with an unstressed syllable, so that's okay, except that it appears to have 11 syllables. But you see, what happens in this case is that the poet did it in such a way that thou and at would be seen as one word. So in reading this poem, if we want to read it properly, we would have to read thou art as that, thou. So it will become that, slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Instead of thou art, it becomes that. So that thou art will be 2 syllables. But when we say that, then thou art becomes 1 syllable. So it becomes that, slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. So that, slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Then it becomes 10. Then we'll have our iambic pentameters. Apart from that, all the other lines are quite okay. So that is it with the fourth question. That is the rhyme, the rhythm, and meter. And that, I think, brings us to the end of our lesson. In our next lesson, which is going to be the third part, in this lesson, we will be looking at the poetic use of language, focusing on the figures of speech, and then we'll also briefly look at the type of poem. That lesson will be a bit short. And I pray you don't miss it. If there are more videos, you can make inquiries about them on the phone line, the WhatsApp line that's provided. Do your best. Make sure you go through the video. If you have any questions, make sure you bring them up for discussion. Thank you. God bless you.